what's your big decision presently? Probably what you're going to eat.
What am I going to have for lunch?
Yes. Well, I am thankful that you've withheld that decision till after we record the podcast. Typically, Frank is eating breakfast and lunch while we are recording, which can be a challenge sometimes if I have to talk longer than I'd like to before I can answer her question. Clearly, you didn't give much thought to the decision to listen to our podcast today, so you are in need of help, and we are just the guys to help you out. In this episode, we talk about big decisions that make you stop and think and stress, and ways that you can overcome your own unconscious bias, your own programming, your heuristics to get over your own narrative. We look at 9 questions you can ask yourself the next time you have to make a life-changing decision.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Mathews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie!
Ian, you son of a bitch.
How's it going, man?
I'm good. How are you? I'm making some big decisions over here.
Are you? What's your big decision presently? Probably what you're going to eat?
What am I going to have for lunch?
Yes. Well, I am thankful that you've withheld that decision till after we record the podcast. Typically, Frank is eating breakfast and lunch while we are recording, which can be a challenge sometimes if I have to talk longer than I'd like to before I can answer her question.
Between pee breaks, I have to eat.
So if you open the newspaper today, we're March 2022. It is littered with dilemmas that businesses, politicians, companies, organizations, dilemmas that they're faced with and big decisions they have to make, much bigger decisions than where Frank is ordering DoorDash from today. You know, you've got, should NATO and America give more military support to Ukraine? Do they cross the border and get more active in this war? Do we do more sanctions?
Where should Deshaun Watson go play football?
Where should Deshaun, which clearly has already been chosen, right? So the Browns went and traded for a quarterback who has multiple lawsuits with 22 different people who are accusing him of sexual assault at massage parlors. So not an easy decision if you're an organization to go into that kind of situation, hire a guy in a long-term contract where you have unresolved lawsuits. You've got the country electing a Supreme Court judge right now. Obviously, that is a very big decision in the history of the country. There are only so many judges and they only come around so often. So if you put someone in there who is going to make decisions that could impact the next 50, 100 years of this country, you should make sure that you vetted that person and put the right person in. You know, should the Fed, we've got inflation, should the Fed raise rates? Right. And there's always that argument of, if you raise them too fast, you're going to kill the economy, and that'll take care of inflation. So do you raise it a quarter point, a half a point, a full point? Should the NCAA allow a biological man to compete in a women's swim meet? Very big dilemma going on right now. If you're not following some of that, a biological man just won the 500-meter freestyle. And obviously it's left a lot of people pretty miffed whose daughters spent their whole life trying to get there and then had to compete against a man. And that somehow is a very big dilemma right now where people are arguing that that's okay. So
what about what's happening in Chicago schools?
What's that?
What about what's happening in the Chicago schools?
So, you know, it got us thinking what goes into a big decision. And when we've been faced with big decisions, how do we handle it? What really even constitutes a big decision? That was something interesting. We just were talking about this about what's the last big decision you made, or what's a big decision you're chewing on right now. I think it's hard to define big. Big decision is I left a company for another one. Big decision is I moved to another city. Big decision is I left my husband of 10 years. I mean, really, if you're talking about monumental decisions, we don't come across those too often. But I think there are impactful decisions that you're making on a weekly basis that move the needle in your career, move the needle for your investments, for what you're trying to do. And we're going to try to unpack how to look at some of those decisions.
So for our loyal listeners, I'm a new-ish dad, right? I got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. We're also making decisions on, is our family finished? Are we expanding that family? Is 2 enough? Like those are pretty big decisions. Like those have ripple effects. And you take for granted some of these things in your life, but there are super big decisions. And Ian and I were kind of talking, we're going to get into this in a second, but we're talking about like things we take for granted. The small stuff that if you were programming a robot are really, really important decisions that, like, you know, should I smash into this wall or should I walk around it? Those are the things you kind of take for granted. And it together and collectively, that's what we hope to talk about, is like, what is the unconscious and what is quite conscious? And is there that gray area between the two where sometimes it's like, I'm going to put this one on autopilot. It's like, maybe you should slow down a little bit and not put that one on autopilot and really think it through.
It's interesting, Frankie, because, you know, most managers say that critical thinking is important in an employee. They ask questions that try to get down to their decision-making capacity, their ability to make a good decision.
You test for it like 8 different ways.
You test for it. You ask behavioral interview questions about it. But there's not a lot out there on how to get better at it. There's a lot of discussion about how we make decisions, how the brain works. And my favorite book on the topic of decision making is it's a book by Daniel Kahneman, who, you know, if he's not number one, he's a top 5 researcher in the field of decision making and how the brain processes and how cognitive biases work. But Daniel Kahneman, he kind of breaks it down in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a great book. I would recommend to anyone. But he says there's really 2 systems that the brain works on. There is system 1, which is intuitive, and system 2, which is reflective. And so system 1 is by far the most active part of our brain. And system 1 it's based on impressions, associations, feelings, intentions, and it's effortless. So system 1 kind of produces this constant representation of the world, and it allows us to walk, to avoid. So give an example. I just, before we started recording, Frank and I always go make sure to go to the bathroom so we don't have to interrupt the episode. But on the way there, I probably made hundreds of decisions. If you had to program me, if I was a robot going to the bathroom in my office and you needed AI, think of all the things I had to do. Stand up, don't run into the desk, pick my foot up and step over my backpack that I left on the ground, open the door, don't run into the wall when you go to the bathroom, right? So wash your hands. All those things I did subconsciously. I didn't really have to think. I just kind of randomly walked over there. So all of this subconscious thinking, which those hundreds and hundreds and thousands of decisions a day that you make, like brushing your teeth, bantering with friends, you're really not taxing your brain when you do those kind of things. System 2 is much slower. It's deliberate. It takes effort. And it's in full effect when we're learning something. So it's mostly in the background, but it materializes when the stakes are much higher. It requires a little bit more rule-based reasoning. So the best example I can think of is if Frank gets into his truck and drives to go get some lunch, he's not going to be using system 2. He's not going to be using any of it. It's pretty much automatic by now. Frank knows his neighborhood. He knows exactly where the taco stand is that he's going to. He knows how to drive. He knows what a street light is. He knows how his truck works. But if a 16-year-old Frank got in that same truck that he had never driven before, and a 16-year-old Frank had never driven in his life, and he had dad sitting in the seat next to him, his system two would be working on overdrive. He would be, everything would be new to him. Nothing would be in the background. He would be sweating. He would be nervous. He'd be clenching the wheel a lot more. And he would be really having to use rule-based reasoning. He wouldn't know the roads. So he would be trying to use some kind of a map or navigation. So just think about yourself. When you learned how to drive, you had to use system two for a while until you got good at it. Until now, when you drive, it's pretty much on autopilot.
I think there's a really good corollary here, right? When it's system two, stakes are higher. Everything is more, it's stakes are higher is the easiest way to say it. And instead of overstating it, why do insurance companies charge 16-year-olds a hell of a lot more for insurance than they do 35 to 50-year-olds? Because 35 to 50-year-olds have hundreds of thousands of miles of experience driving, and it's become system one. There's a testosterone piece and like a maturity thing too, but the act has gone from something like, I think I can think back to when I was a kid. I was in the car with my dad and it was pouring down rain, and I just jammed on the brakes and I did like a 180, and thank God I didn't hit anything. But I learned in that moment, don't jam on the brakes, pump the brakes slowly. And as a 47-year-old, I do that, just like with snowstorms. But these are things that even though you're told it or taught it at the DMV, it goes from something that's a 2 to, oh, I've lived through this hundreds of times, just like not bumping into the wall, going to take a pee. You learn.
Yeah. So so first, you got to understand that there's two different ways that your mind is always working. And system one is fantastic at making the little decisions all day, the little decisions of what you're doing, getting yourself around. It also is really good. So if you think about if your brain had to really think about everything. So if it had to contemplate every possible outcome ever all the time, you would go clinically insane. You just wouldn't be able to operate if you had to think about everything. So what system one does a great job of doing is it makes sense of millions of inputs, and it tells you the ones to ignore that you don't need to worry about. And it helps develop a narrative. So what it does is it kind of actively suppresses alternative stories that might come up in your head. It lets you know that some things are not risks that are worth worrying about. Whereas if you ever had like we have a dog, and she's a year old, but as a puppy, every noise freaked her out. Every single noise she interpreted as a threat. It was a bear or a wolf coming to eat her. No matter what, everything freaked her out. Now she's a lot more relaxed. Her system one is good at suppressing a lot of the noise and not thinking of, now she just freaks out when she hears thunder. She hasn't gotten comfortable with that yet. But I think it's similar. Like your brain can't possibly interpret millions of inputs. It has to be able to suppress a lot of it and create its own narrative of what you focus on.
The childhood brain or the puppy brain are perfect ways to state it. It's you graduate from things being system twos to many, many, many things being system ones. And if you start thinking about like, once you get over adolescence and out of teen and into your 20s and your 30s, and you move past that, you really start to have all these experiences and things that were once challenging. Like if you ever heard the saying, Ian, even an expert was a beginner once, that expert was all system two, and it just became system one. Like a great argument is Michael Jordan, right? He wasn't the athlete he was at 35, but he was still pretty damn good because he had so much knowledge and he would outsmart things compared to others because of that. And that's one of the things that I think society rewards people for is how many system two decisions do you deserve to make? How many are you given? Like I just read a book on 9/11 and ultimately going after bin Laden. The amount of decisions, the amount of people who are making incredibly unique decisions around this very highly sensitive topic and item
And
It's incredible.
the stakes, right?
Stakes are high. Obama, the president, was basically admitted, if this fails publicly, I'll be a one-term president. But those are high state. That's why this is a publicly elected office. This is a very important job, because that's it. Ian mentioned Supreme Court justices. These are very important things that require a high level of thought, and that is the system 2 type of stuff.
I mean, look at Frankie. We were talking about it when it happened, but the United States decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. That decision was obvious about 10 years ago, but it never happened because presidents kind of knew there's a high probability it just won't go smoothly and I could be out of office. So, it didn't go smoothly, obviously, but I almost kind of give the president a little bit of credit because he's the only one that had the guts to do an obvious decision. Now, it wasn't executed well, could have been executed much better, but I do give him credit for actually doing it because that was an obvious decision when Trump was in. It was an obvious decision when Obama was in. It wasn't even an obvious decision for Bush to go there. So if you just look at the history of it, that decision it's the stakes, right? So that's all system 2.
And let's take another nuanced look at that. I'm a new president. Should I do this in year 4 or year 1? Voters' minds are not as, they're worried about themselves. They have short memories, right? There's a 24-hour news cycle. If this flops, I'll do it in year 1 because it's the right thing to do. And I got 3 years to recover. That's system 2. This is strategy. These are the pieces that all come together. And the people who are most highly paid, quarterbacks in the NFL, CEOs, people who have these incredible jobs, have taken hard things and made them system 1. Watch Aaron Rodgers play. He almost looks lazy back there. He just kind of like this, and it goes 50 yards. He flicks the wrist. That isn't lazy. That's an incredible amount of work, taking something that's insanely difficult, working so hard. The layperson thinks, wow, he's nonchalant, because then he can focus on the system 2 stuff. And that is, I think, how at least where we're at in the world now, that's how society rewards employees and people. So if you're listening to this and you're new, this is a great piece of advice that I've talked about here before. I've told Ian. I had someone come up to me and say, if you want to get promoted, can I give you some advice? I said, sure. And this was someone telling me, and I said, what's the advice? They're like, don't worry about getting promoted. Become great at your job. We'll have to promote you. But it fits perfectly right here, because what he was saying is take a bunch of system 2, turn it into system 1, and become great. Then we'll give you more system 2 in a new role. You'll process it, and what used to be hard will be very easy.
And so, system 1 is so good at piecing together incomplete information and building this contextual story that we all live by, that we're not even aware it's operating. And that's how it leads us astray. So when you say the term cognitive dissonance is really just a separation of the story we believe to be true and new facts that are coming in arguing against the narrative in our mind. And that's how cognitive biases happen. And there are literally hundreds of cognitive biases. So you ever hear someone say, I'm not a biased person? They're full of shit. You're a human being. By nature, your biology.
We're all inherently biased.
You're biased. You're not a robot. Your mind has a story that it's created and it rejects information. So this is important to know. Your mind rejects new information that goes against the narrative that your mind has created. So it will either ignore it, it will not listen to it, it will tune it out, or it will actively fight against it like a virus. And we almost, by nature, it's called a subconscious bias because we're not conscious of it. So we never catch ourselves in the act of making an intuitive error. You can't catch yourself. That's why it's called a cognitive bias, an unconscious bias, because we can't possibly know that our mind is trying to protect us and make things easier on our decision making. But by contrast, so that's all system 1. If we tackle and fail to solve a difficult problem using system 2, we're painfully aware of it. So let's go back to the Obama and Osama bin Laden conversation. Had they raided and he wasn't there, and now they went into another country without that country's approval, and now it's all out there that we did it and we didn't get them, the amount of thought all of those people put into making that decision, they would know exactly where they went wrong. They would go deconstruct it, they would go back. And that's obvious with a system 2 error that you make in decision making. But with system 1, you make these mistakes all the time and you don't know why. You don't even know it was a mistake. You just lost out on something. You're not aware of it. So that's what makes bias so dangerous. That's what makes system 1. The error really is you allowing yourself to use system 1 on a very big decision. I think that's what it comes down to, doesn't it, Frankie?
Very, very much so. You use the wrong processes or system of grading a problem. And yeah, there's another part of it, which is, I think worth talking about. Like, what about things that are programmed wrong, right? Like, what if you have a system 1, but you're raised to do it wrong? I'll just use a really simple one, like using a word incorrectly, like grammar. And so it becomes system 2 as you're learning your English and everything else, you're learning your language. But someone in your family, this happens in my family, uses the word wrong. And then it gets into system 1. It's just the word. And then you realize, like, when you're like 30, you're like, why do people look at me weird when I use that word? Like, my wife is a linguist. She's like, yeah, you got a lot of these programmed in wrong. So we got to like unwind them because I now know they're wrong. But like, I didn't know that. This is how I learned English. Like, so it can permeate in so many different ways. And it can get into your head because the system 1 stuff is the things that's kind of rote. But system 2 is the stuff where you really have to process.
So something Kahneman says that I really like is just knowing that you have biases is not enough to help you overcome them. And I love that quote. I love it. His take is that too many people in academia focus on teaching what the bias is, not how to tackle decisions that will root out your biases, that will help you think through the decision better. And so Frank and I tried to think about, I think the best way we wanted to attack this to try to help people with this is we looked at questions we ask ourselves when we're faced with really big questions. So what questions can we ask ourselves that root out some of the mistakes that we might make, that maybe root out some of the system 1 thinking, that force us to be slower, more deliberate, more effortful, more reflective, more system 2. So we're going to go through 9 questions that you can ask yourself the next time you have a very big, should I leave my company? Should I go for a promotion? Should I invest in Bitcoin? Should I buy that rental apartment? Should I start a business? Whatever it is, when you have that big, should I put my kid in private school? When you have a big decision that requires system 2, these questions can help you really make sure you're making that decision deliberately. So you ready to start without any further ado, Frankie?
Let's do it.
Okay. So number 1 question we have is, did I seek out dissenting opinions with people? And this is important, not just dissenting opinions, but dissenting opinions with people who have no skin in the game. So Frankie, why do you think I added the no skin in the game piece of it?
Well, it comes down to one of my answers, right? I talk about, I have 2 coaches who are by nature, they're foreigners who are by nature people who are contrarian. But if they stop getting a paycheck from me, or if I do send them a check every month, are they really completely unbiased? Or does their opinion change because because of the circumstance? I look like a paycheck now more than I do just someone to give dissenting opinion to. So that's very much part of it.
I think so. And I also think you want to find someone with no skin in the game also, because it doesn't help to go get an opinion of someone who's also using their system 1 and has similar biases that you have. So
Right.
if I'll give an example. So if
But
there
it's
are
hard,
two,
but before you give your example though, but it's also hard to find qualified people who sometimes don't have this ratcheted back to a system one, because you have to be incredibly high. Like you can go find someone and say, hey, should I get my knee surgery done? And they have no idea what a knee is. Like they're going to give you an uninformed answer. So it's a challenge, but
Yeah.
for sure.
you take like, so let's say two managers in a company, and the company is severely understaffed. You're just desperate to get people. And one manager interviews a person who they're kind of on the fence with. Going and asking the opinion of someone else to interview that person who is just as desperate to hire people, they're probably going to be leaning towards hiring them if they're on the fence as well. So I have a good example of this. I had my manager once that wanted to promote me into a much bigger job. I was in a senior regional job, and he wanted to put me over all the regionals. And I couldn't find the right person to save my life. And finally, I had someone that I thought had the experience to do it, and a recruiter had brought him to me. And obviously, the recruiter had a lot on the line. Recruiter wanted me to do it because he'd get paid. But he was also under pressure because he hadn't found this person for me for a while. But anyway, I was really close to making this decision, and I could have myself, but my stomach just didn't feel great about it. So I asked an HR manager and another, like my peer from a totally different business, that this person would never interact with. And I made sure they had no skin in the game. And I asked them to interview him, and it was hilarious. So they interviewed him, and he could not have bombed worse. I mean, and they were trying to be nice. These weren't the toughest guys in the world, but I knew they would be objective. But the stuff they told me that they pulled out of the interview, like he was a screamer, he was a yeller. He admitted to some of those things. When they asked about why he left one of the companies, he kind of spilled the beans that he had got into a lawsuit with them. He had never told me that. It would have been a horrendously bad decision if I would have hired this region manager just because I was desperate and needed to move up in the organization. And they saved me. They had no skin in the game. They had dissenting opinions. And I was in system one thinking, trying to create a narrative of I can work around his flaws, when really they kind of hit me in the face with a sledgehammer and said, no, you can't. This will be a terrible decision if you make it.
So let's talk about this, because most of the people here either own businesses or trying to get promoted, right? So let's talk about it from the standpoint of I own a business or I'm a manager. That's the reason why you have a panel interview in the first place. And the panel interview is multiple people talk to a candidate. And I have a story about the same thing. I was trying to interview an executive assistant. She was wonderful with me. And I had two other people who didn't need the executive assistant, who were just other people in the company, who I said, here, take a second opinion. And she was awful to them, just mean and nasty and rude. And they came in, I'm like, she's an absolute yes. And I needed an assistant. And they were like, no, she's terrible. She'll be awful for the rest of us. And it was great. So it's a good way to kind of put that in place. And then what we do, because as we're growing, is we'll have a department where we might have, a significant need, but we'll have someone who's not in the department who doesn't feel desperate also on the panel. And I kind of did it subconsciously, but the whole point is that person's often more critical because you don't bring a bad person in. So if you're interviewing, do realize you've got multiple inputs on purpose set up to catch these things. And this is how you can do it, because you might lean into somebody that likes you or is desperate, but at the same time, there's other people there who are hoping to kind of even the playing field and make sure you don't slip through.
I think in general, when you put an interview panel together, an interview panel is worthless if your panel of managers, there's 2 or 3 of them, all have the exact same pressures they're feeling. So I think the fact that Frank takes someone who this person's not going to work for them, they're not even going to work on their same team, they're in a different department, they're from different. And if you don't have this, if you're a small company where everyone's just in on it, get a friend from another company to do a little interview with them or talk to them or go out with them. And I also love something you did. A lot of people will have the people like maybe a future peer. They'll have them go to lunch with them, or they'll have, because a lot of times that person's shield comes off, and they'll, by the questions they ask or the way they treat the waiter, or the way they treat that person, do they only show respect to people that they work for? And you can learn some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So question number 2, am I overly influenced by a small sample set, by one story? So we talked a little bit about this in an episode called The Gambler's Fallacy, where we are just highly influenced by recent data. So I have a great story here of one of the worst decisions I ever made in my life. A friend of mine who was known for making terrible decisions for most of his life, even though I love him very much, struck it big with a penny stock. This is like in 1999, 2000, and struck it big enough. I'm talking about like a 200x pop on a penny stock. Struck it big enough that he quit his job for a company a year after graduating college and went out and bought a convertible sport car and picked me up in it. I didn't know anything about penny stocks, but I knew I was pissed that I had 40 years of working ahead of me, and he had already retired a year after graduating college on one penny stock. He bought several of them, but this one hit. And I had one example. That's all I had. I had one example that he had gotten, that it would be like me running out and buying lotto tickets because someone else won the lotto. He straight up won the lotto. And so what did I do? I took most of what I had at the time, which I think was maybe $9,000, $10,000. That's about all I had. I literally everything I had. And I bought the next big penny stock that he had. But it was kind of like Bud in Wall Street, Frank. He didn't have a second idea. He just had the first one. He didn't have Blue Star Airlines yet. He just had the first one. And so I lost everything. It went to zero. And I was overly influenced by a very small sample set. And if I'd have stepped back, I should have said, do I know anyone else who's made money this way? Has he made more money on any of his other stocks? Can I watch this for a while to see what I'm doing? I did almost no research. I just bought the next one he bought because I was pissed off that he wasn't working and he was now rich. He subsequently obviously gave all of that money back, and it didn't take long, maybe another year. So had I watched for another year, I would have seen him have to go get a job again in a corporation and seen that's probably not a good path for me.
Yeah. We talk about this all the time, and now we have ways to think about it. It becomes system 2, or it becomes system 1. You're like, I'm not going to rush into that. We've talked about that 1,000 times on this podcast. Ian and I spend inordinate amounts of time when we're on the phone together, just talking about, should I do this? Should I not? And you start to see things, and then kind of like success or problems leave clues, and you get smarter over time. An example that I have on this with being influenced by a small sample set, it's not necessarily a small sample set, but it's a sample set that's insulated. Like I'm in the mastermind world, in the single family real estate world. Ian had quit his job. We were looking to do a couple of deals together, and I was like, why don't you come with me to a conference? So I brought Ian to this conference with me in Miami. We had a great time. It was interactive, and I'm in this world all the time. So I don't think about people's leverage and their debt structure and how they are. And like Ian walks up to me after like meeting the 35th person who he's like, wow, all of these people are incredibly leveraged and cash poor, because everybody's betting on the come in real estate. You're trying to take the money out of your deal and reinvest it in the next deal. And it's constant. And it's one of those things where, although that is a way to get rich in real estate, it's also a way to go broke in real estate. And although I know it, it kind of just become normal. And I let it wash over me. I'm like, you know what? You're right. It's just an outsider who is unbiased, who has no skin in the game, and is looking at this small sample set and saying, you may want to think about this. And did I make huge changes based on? Not really. But what it did do is it was kind of a fresh set of eyes looking at something.
I think in something like that, when you get another opinion like that, what it can do is it could kind of make you think, okay, am I just following a herd? How am I separating myself? Do I want to be known as the one who's just cash poor, that's always leveraged to the hilt? Or can I separate myself by having a little bit more of a cash position? And shortly after that, we went and saw Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett is never cash poor. And he's not an all-in, reinvest everything all the time. Warren keeps enough cash that when it starts raining, he goes and buys stuff. And so I think you had a couple of data points in a short period of time that at least made you stop and think, okay, I want to have some flexibility. It can't be 100% growth all the time.
This isn't in here. I think we talked about it with Alistair. But it's also something where when everybody thinks something can't go wrong, it's usually the moment when it does. It's like, there's no way that can happen. Like, there's no way Mike Tyson can lose to Buster Douglas. We fucking did. So like when you start hearing that small sample set kind of telling you like something can't happen, it's the time to start thinking, could it?
So question number 3, what are my alternatives? And have I vetted them as strongly as my favorite choice? So whenever you have a decision, it's rare that you're truly the old Ben Franklin. You got to put them on both sides, 50, 50, 100. Your gut is always sort of leaning one way. And your gut is usually leaning the way that will prevent the most loss. It's normally the loss aversion way that your gut is leaning, but you normally have a favorite. And I think the important thing is that you have a group of people that you talk to, and you do this yourself, that you are thinking. Most times when we make a decision, it is an either or. It is an A or B. It is only 2 choices. That's it. And a great question is always is there a third alternative? What's the third? What's the fourth alternative? What are other things we can do? So I have an example of this. So I had my direct reports came to me. We had a broken closing department in our mortgage company. It just wasn't working, and we needed more supervision. We needed more leadership. We were growing, and we were putting a lot more on these people at the time because there were more checklists, there were more regulations, a lot of stuff. And the proposal that was brought to me, and they did a really good job of vetting it, thinking through it. It was like the second or third time they brought it to me, was to go bring in some regional closing managers and hire a number of closing supervisors around them. So we would have 20 offices, but there would be more local leadership around hiring standards, things of that nature. But it was a multi-million-dollar proposal. And so I could have looked at it as we have 2 choices: keep doing what we're doing, do nothing, and keep making mistakes, or go with more local leadership, more everything. And the second part, what I didn't like about it is it had all of the same trappings of the first one. You could still have turnover. You could still have bad hires. You still had people too separated to where you were really getting a lot of knowledge. And what we weren't thinking about was, why don't we centralize? And what would centralizing, what would it do for us? And what that did is it brought all the leadership together in one place. It let us hire a lot faster because we could train people. It's obviously easier to train a new closer, Frankie, if you hire them in an office with 50 closers than training one closer in an office with 2. Because the other 2 they have jobs to do, and it's hard for them to do it. With 50, you spread it out over. And so we ended up, the third choice is the one we went with. It was actually the cheapest. It was the most effective. And it was one that we could implement, even though it was harder to implement, because we had to move all those folks. We had to hire a ton of people in Pittsburgh. We ended up putting 100 people in one centralized department, and they still have that same department today. That was the best decision.
So when I was coming up with this, I really struggled to come up with an example, right, of what are my alternatives and have I vetted them as strongly as my first choice. And I thought of something. The best example, and Ian and I will both tell you this if you talk to us, is a lot of times you bring an idea home to your wife and you just start talking about this, and something you knew was certain can turn into being very uncertain quickly, because your wife will ask you a handful of questions like, do you think about that? And they're not doing it to be mean or rude or to disrespect you, but they have a very different lens with which they're looking at things. So they are often bringing up ideas that you hadn't even considered, because like, why would the hell would you consider it? It makes no sense to consider it. And they're asking, and it's like, oh, wow, that is actually a very good thought that I had missed. And who you marry, like Warren Buffett talks about this a lot, who you marry makes a big deal, a big difference in the whole thing, like who your support system is, who you talk to in the standard course of business. And all of these are just different levels of either safety net or something. Your network, people you talk to on the regular, your family, your friends, your spouse. I'm going to do this. And then they ask that question. And I've made big decisions that I was 100% certain of. And my wife's asked me, like, have you thought about that? I'm like, I hadn't. And I changed my mind, because it's just another fresh set of eyes that look at something, and it's very valuable. Sometimes
It's
like,
also,
yeah,
your wife often doesn't have the same, she's not as close to it, and doesn't have the same skin in the game, won't have to live with the decision as much as you will. You shelter her from it. She's doing she's got her career, you've got your career. You'll have to live with that decision way more than she will. So that also comes back to, she is an unbiased opinion that's not too close to it, that might have a completely different idea.
correct.
So question number 4, what change in the environment would result in this decision looking terrible? So when I say environment, that could be the economy, it could be anything that's outside of your control. So the best example we could think of together, Frank and I have now done 2 substantial real estate deals. And before we've done either of them and went out and asked for money, we go through a litany of misery, I'll say. What if interest rates skyrocket? What if there's a banking crisis and we can't get debt? What if our note gets called? What if there's a really ugly recession? What if a fire burned down every building? What if there's a 100-year storm, which turns out that actually happened to our Westwood property with a flood the first day of owning it? What about inflation? We go through all of these things, and I would say, at least in the couple of deals that we've done together, Frankie, we've spent a lot more time looking at the downside than we have the upside, to the point where, like, once we get to a certain hurdle, we're like, that'd be great. Let's not dream about how much bigger it could be. What's the downside? We spend 99% of our time talking about, don't lose our friends' money. Can we get to 25, 30%? Yes. I think we could maybe quadruple that, but let's not even talk about it. I feel pretty good about 25. Now let's talk about how we don't lose people money. We do that all the time.
That's right. And with the riskier stuff, I do it alone. Like, I do it in a different entity name. We do these different things, right? But when we're going to raise capital, it's just, you just make sure and you ask a different level of question. And we've been pretty successful. We don't have a huge sample set of stuff we've done together, but like in my business at this point, I've done multiple 3,000-4,000 deals, and you do lose on some. So you have to kind of come up with a metric or a thought process or different items that you can ask to say, like, how do we do this? And if there is a change in the environment, the thing to think about is, like, what are my other alternatives? So when the pandemic hit, Ian and I had just raised all this money. We had a bunch of our friends in the deal, and Ian and I were talking. He was playing a ton of baseball with IJ, because you couldn't do anything but be outside. So Ian's outside with IJ. They're having these incredible times. He's like, Frankie, when Max is old enough, we'll come down there. We'll buy a house. We'll help him learn his baseball. And I'm like, buy a house? We're going to still have 75 left. You don't have to buy anything. Just move into one of those. And Ian laughed. We had bought 75 houses and sold none of them. So like, Ian's like, a little too soon, big guy, a little too soon.
Too soon. Let's sell one house before you make that joke.
But the first thing we did in our quarterly update in April was we just talked about it. Hey, you got into this deal because it's real estate, and real estate usually does well over long term. We're not panicking. We're not going to We're not going to sell everything now while the market is fleeing. We're gonna pause, and we're gonna continue to collect rents, and we're gonna see what changes. And we had thought about this. If there was a problem, we came up with, we can just collect rents. If we collect rents, these are the returns. Is it the numbers we hope to hit? No, but is it still a pretty strong return? Yeah. And it isn't a loss. So, but these are things you start to think through.
So number 5, am I being overly influenced by someone with a competing agenda? And I think that's an incredibly important question to ask yourself if you are leaning on one person more than others, and that person is overly biased themselves. They might have a narrative themselves. So for me, by far, my best example of this is when I left General Electric. I had multiple people pulling on me. It was really interesting. I had GE wanting me to move from Chicago to Atlanta, and they'd given me a very big promotion, and they wanted me to be the youngest vice president and all of these things. So they were very biased. We're going to make your career, kid. You're on the path. You're going to move so fast. And then we had my family, especially Jenny's family, did not want me to move. Like, why are you moving to DC? This doesn't make any sense. Your family's here. I had NVR, and my friend Macaulay, who's the one who referred me to NVR, really wanted me to come to NVR. So if I talked to him, I was always going to get the biased view from him. He'd already left GE and come to NVR. So of course, he's going to only tell me the good things about the company. And he did. He only told me the good things about the company. And so, Frankie, it was interesting. I really never felt that alone in my life in a decision. To her credit, I'll say Jenny was probably the most in the middle. She didn't want to leave Chicago and her family, but she also knew NVR was a really good opportunity and was beside me. But I felt really alone in that decision, because who am I going to talk to? The folks at GE didn't want me to leave. My friends in Chicago didn't want me to leave. My parents were nervous about me leaving a great job where I had done well. That's one where I had to say, you know what? It's my career. All of these people that are giving me advice are not going to, they're not in charge of my career. They're just giving me a little slice of advice right now. At the end of the day, I'm the one responsible for the next 50 years of earning in my career. And if I screw it up, I'm not going to come back and point at anyone that gave me advice now. It'll be on me if I turn out to not be a very good producer for my family. And so I just remember feeling very alone in that time. And it had to be that way. Because I knew if I leaned on any one of those contingents too much, they were going to give me heavily biased opinions.
So the best example I can come up with this for me personally is when I had a relationship with a woman for almost 8 years. And people would joke about, like, you took her baby making years and all these other things. And like, I was torn for a very long time. I talked to Ian about it, but no one wants to tell you break up with someone. They're not going to tell you that. And like, my family all adored this woman. I wasn't happy in this relationship. I felt trapped. I had all the negatives and I wanted out. But my friends all tried to be neutral. And then my family was, kind of pulling for this woman. And then her family was clearly, she wanted to stay together. So she was kind of pulling at it too. And there is that thing when there's a big life decision, and someone in my life is going through something similar with this now. It's job change, potentially moving their family, like it's big things, right? And everyone's got a competing agenda. And sometimes you just got to pull away. You got to look at it and you say, what is it that is best for me? And there's a toggle between being for everyone and kind of being selfish, and you have to pick that line. And it kind of comes down to one of these things sometimes where they tell you on an airplane, if it's going down, to put your mask on first before someone else's. Because if you don't protect yourself, you can't protect others. And sometimes it is as simple as you just have to make the right decision for you. And I think Ian is dead right. it's lonely as hell. Like there's that moment of like, you just have to do it alone. There's certain things you can do with others, but there are big moments where you have to do them alone. And I'll flip to the other side of that. When I decided to get engaged and get married, I did that alone. It was a lot easier because it was more happy and fun, and people like to celebrate the good things. But that's a decision where you can't call your friends. Like, you got to make that decision alone, because ultimately it's your decision. It's not anyone else's.
I think there's also the other side of it, Frank, where I knew in that decision that it had to be mine. And I at some point I stopped talking to anyone else. It was just me thinking about, I already got all the inputs. Thank you, everyone. I need a few days. And I knew I had to make this decision, because if the decision went wrong and I felt like I was really influenced by one person, I would be bitter with that person. I would be bitter. I would hold a grudge that I gave advice that I shouldn't have. And we'll get to the next question here, but based on the relationship piece, I had a friend who had a longtime girlfriend and just wasn't happy, and they were close to getting engaged, and we went out to dinner, and he point blank asked me my advice. And I said, I'm not going to give you advice, because that's cheap. And I don't go home with her every night. Like, brother, I'm here for you. I want you to understand that whatever decision you make, our friendship is not going to change. And I probably said something similar to you about it. But what I told this guy was, I don't go home every night and spend time with her. You're responsible for being happy. I'm not responsible for the decisions you make that make you happy. And if you're not happy, you have to own that. And it's the same with a career. Only one person cares about your career for your whole career. Only one person cares about your happiness for your whole life, and that's you. So some decisions you just can't be influenced by other people, and you have to make them based on what's best for you.
So this comes back to the opening, right? In the opening, we talked about 1 and 2 on the decisions. I think people who work properly to turn tier 2 into tier 1 type of decisions, what happens is you get a chance, you're better at it, and you process it. And big decisions are easily, or more, you're ready for it. You're trained. It's kind of like getting ready for a fight every single day, a professional fight. You're training, you're sparring, you're doing all the little things. And then every now and again, you get stress tested with, does this relationship work? Do I need to move? You're building that muscle. But if you haven't built that muscle, you don't have the ability to process it. And if enough things that should be tier 1s are still tier 2s, you never have the system built to actually process the tier 2 stuff, because because you're just wasting too much time in there with things that should have graduated up, if that makes sense. So like that, it's something you see a lot of time with people. Like, we all have people in our lives, many of them have been grandfathered in, who make terrible fucking decisions. And we interlope with them. We don't see them all the time, but we go to a Vegas trip with them, or we go do stuff with them because they're so fun. But when you look at their lives and you kind of look at it at a cross section, they struggle with the big decisions. They don't struggle with, should we have another shot? The answer is always yes. But they struggle with these other things, and they can't help you with it because they haven't graduated to that point. And those are the things that, like, should I make this decision? No, you shouldn't even ask me that decision, because that has to be on you. And I think that permeates through this episode.
So question number 6, what is the risk of being overly cautious? And I think another way of asking yourself this question is, what are the unintended consequences of doing nothing? So let's fast forward 20 years from my decision to leave GE. Had I done the easy route, which is stay with a company that was treating me well, but the pay and the upside weren't as great, had I done that, I wouldn't have even a small percentage of what I have from having gone to NVR. I knew the company was struggling. I knew there were problems with leadership. I knew that we were losing market share. I knew that our best years, I just knew it. I knew our best years were behind us. I just felt it. And I know a lot of people, Frankie, that stayed loyal to GE and stayed there a long time. Their retirement accounts aren't worth crap. I mean, that stock's down 80% over years. Their stock options never made any money. Their equity never made any money. And that the riskiest thing at the time, so this is what's wild. At the time, GE is a top 10 company in the world, market cap. And I have been promoted 4 times in 6 years, rocket ship of a career there. At the time, leaving
Mostly lateral.
Leaving for a much smaller company in real estate in Washington, D.C., leaving my network, leaving everything, felt so risky. But when I look back, the riskiest decision I could have made was staying at a dying company that didn't know it was dying. That would have been the riskiest decision I ever made, was just staying still and being a executive at a company that had lost its greatness.
So what's funny about GE is in 2009, right? What is the risk, or are we being overly cautious? What are the unintended consequences? So this is a bit of a story, but I'm going to tell it. 2009, March, I'd already quit NVR. We're in the middle of this shit recession. Stock market bottoms out in 2009. I call Ian, and Ian, I'm like, I'm going to buy some GE stock. And GE stock was at $6. Ian had quit GE, was an insider to a degree, not illegally, but he knew the company. And he's like, Frankie, don't do it. It's a terrible decision. Don't do it. And I was kind of pissed because it tripled. Now it subsequently bounced back to zero, like back to 6 or less. But the point is, like, Ian had a different purview than me. I think I had good information. I could have made a good decision at that moment in time, and I would have wrote it up, but I didn't buy it. But what did happen was this. I never blame Ian. He gave me the best advice he knew how to give me. But what I did is I synthesized it. And the next time I looked at an investment, I did bounce it off with people, but I knew. And I didn't buy stock. I bought houses in Richmond because I knew houses in Richmond better than I knew GE stock. And I knew replacement value, and I knew those things. And I wasn't cautious. And I was doing things that prevented me from buying the GE stock, but it had changed enough where I was like, wait a minute, these are the right decisions to make on this. And that's where I went all in, because I have a subject matter expertise. I have a different thing. And that's what kind of fueled me. But these are the same decisions I make, which should I continue to put money in real estate, or should I go to Bitcoin, or should I go to this, or should I chase after penny stocks? Like, I don't know those things, but I do know these. So am I being overly cautious? Perhaps, but I'm also doing things that have a very good set of understandings. I get it. I know what the exit strategies are. So it's different, but these are things that this is how system 2 becomes system 1, and then you get to focus on higher level stuff.
I think it's a fascinating example too, because I think I'm wired the same way I was 10 years ago, 12 years ago when I gave you that decision. And looking back, if you asked me again, knowing what I know now, I still would have said that, because I think I never want to recommend anything to anyone that I wouldn't want to hold for a long time. Like,
it was the right decision, even
you're
though
not
it's short term.
you're not like a stock guy. You don't even look at the stock market most days. I know that about you. You know, you're a real estate guy. You're in the weeds of real estate every day. If I need to know real estate, I call you. You don't look at stocks. So that stock could have doubled and went back to 6, and you wouldn't even have known it. It was just too volatile, and we didn't know enough. So I was like, Frankie, don't mess with that thing. And I would still probably say it, but I think it's fascinating in that I think it's a great lesson for both of us in that. One, what I would have done different. I remember this conversation. I really remember it. And I was trying to protect you. So I was like, Frank, straight up, don't do it. What I should have said is, Frank, I own 0 GE stock. I plan on buying no more GE stock. Here's why. I don't know how much more risk they have in European mortgages. Every week, something new comes out. That
we did talk about the mortgages then. We did. I remember.
I don't know what that how many bad decisions they made. And I can't tell you, recommend doing something I wouldn't do, but I was a little more like, Frank, don't do it. I should have said, Frank, here's exactly why I wouldn't buy GE and why I don't own GE today.
Yeah.
I have since changed a lot of that. So even when I invest now, or even when I raise capital, I always say, here's why I invested in this deal myself. I've still yet to raise any money for anything that I'm not personally invested in. And I always say, here's why I did it. Here's what I think the upside is. Here's why I think the downside's controllable, blah, blah, blah. And I think when you learn that, I think that's interesting too. So, good friend of mine started a restaurant. It's since become an absolute monster franchise, Cooper's Hawk. I was at the building when it was a shell, when he had a bunch of debt, and I could have invested in Cooper's Hawk at the very beginning, and I turned it down. What I've learned was by being too cautious, I could have put a small amount in and it would have made 10, 20x. But by being too cautious, the next time a really smart, talented friend came to me with a startup, a kid that I believed in, I invested in it. And the second time it happened, I did it again, but even bigger. And because in each one, so the first one was Code Guard, and I invested and I made great money on it. I should have invested more. I was a little bit, but you learn, right? Like the first time I said no.
Toe in the water.
Put a good chunk in. The third time it came my way, I pushed some chips in, bro. I'm like, I'm not going to look back and say, I wish I'd have put more into it this time. And I think those kind of things, there is a risk of being too cautious, of passing. And especially when you know the person that's behind it, there's risks of being too cautious.
For sure. And at the same time, you have to be prudent. So there's no right answer all the time. And nobody gets this right 100% of the time. Like Gary Vee is incredibly good at figuring out tech startups, and he missed Uber. He talks about it like nobody can get 100%, and you don't need to.
Yep. So question 7, am I looking at this based on the best case scenario? Am I seeing this only from rose colored glasses? So I think this is way too easy to do when this is the old be fearful when everyone's greedy, greedy when everyone's fearful. When things are going well, that's when this bias really kicks in. When you're looking at a chart that is going from the bottom left corner to the upper right, whether it's a year, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, it's really easy to just take your ruler out and draw a line and extrapolate it out into the future. And as soon as you start doing that, just basing it on what you've seen in the past, that's when you start getting into making decisions based on what's the absolute best that could happen is really dangerous, in my opinion.
Yes. So I'm in real estate. Everybody thinks there's absolutely no way this thing ends. Like, because of inventory. Like, inventory is a cause. It's not an effect. Or it's an effect. It's not a cause. It's one of these things, the byproduct of the fact that where we are. But it's like, you have to think of it from the alternative. One of the books that Ian and I both talk about all the time and love, Ray Dalio is doing a book now. It's called The Changing World Order. It really makes you think about, are we standing on quicksand? And the other one that we reference often is This Time Is Different, 8 Centuries of Fiscal Folly. Like so many people like pound their chest. I can't believe I made an extra $100,000 more in this deal. It wasn't you. That was the market. The market has wind at your back, and that's the reason it's pushing you and pushing you and pushing you ahead. It isn't you, and you have to be very mindful of that. And you have to also think about, who are the snake oil salesmen around me who are trying to take advantage, but so many people just don't know it. Like, how many people are incredibly well researched? So that's where having contrarian opinions, the first 6 things we talked about, are so important to make sure you don't get trapped at number 7, because most of us look at things with rose colored glasses.
Yeah, Frank, you and I are both in this tech startup. Best case scenario is we're $1 billion company, and that sure would be great for me and you. We'll buy an island, right? But if I really believed that, and I got so sold into the fact that this could be there, I would have put my entire net worth into it. But I didn't. Both David and I we've got a good chunk, but we're still limited. And that's why we raised $4 million instead of putting more and more of our own money into it, because look, you got to look at the reality. It's a startup. It's a technology company. Things could go wrong. So, you have to force yourself when things are going well, not to just dream when you make a decision. You have to force yourself to think about the downside.
It's the only way to also stay agile. If you are completely convinced there is no other way other than this, you are going to become tone deaf to things that change around you, and you're not going to be able to adapt, pivot, and change. And that's critical. You have to keep it's why it's so hard for people who are super successful. We talk about the emperor with no clothes. It's very easy to build those walls around yourself and not let other people give you feedback. But as soon as you turn off the ability to take feedback or see what's really happening and know that it's you that's going to solve the problem, you're not going to be able to. So it closes you in.
Question 8, is my worst case scenario really bad enough? Or am I even raising the floor of what could happen on this? Frankie, do you remember what my first line was in the first email we sent to investors after RVA 75? Do you remember what I said?
The one that happened after COVID?
Yes.
Yeah, like the dust. Yeah, it was like COVID's happened. Tom Hanks, like, what is this thing with COVID? Tom Hanks has COVID. Like, oh my God. It was like kind of like an arc. And then you're like, oh, did I just invest a bunch of money in single family houses in Richmond?
Yes. And so I went in, I kind of made fun of it. I said, I think Frank and I are pretty careful guys, and we vetted every possible thing that could have gone wrong. What we didn't think about was a 100-year plague. We forgot to think about that. We're sorry for that, because the floor can always be worse than what you think it is. So you have to ask yourself, really, what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario might not be I lose all my money. The worst case scenario might be I lose all my money and I'm forced to put more money into this. So it could be even more than what you think it is. So I think in a lot of the people that Frank interacts with now are real estate operators. And I don't think they think about the downsides of all the debt they're taking out. Their downside is so much incredibly lower than what they're assuming it is, because a lot of them aren't pre-selling anything and they're just so cash poor. It's got to be scary as hell.
There was a builder I met who's in Arizona, and they sell 400 houses annually, and they build all of them on spec, which is a really bad practice. And if you look at any of the publicly traded builders, they might build 10% on spec, maybe a little bit more, but most of them are less than 5% on spec. And if you don't know what I mean by on spec, it means on speculation. So I don't have a pre-sold house with a down payment and a family who's associated with moving into this house. It's speculative. It's either because that family fell out and it's kind of an inventory without a sale, or it's the other side of the equation where, hey, we're going to roll the dice a little bit. If the market continues to appreciate, we're going to sell this thing for more, so we're not going to pre-sell it. That's what spec is. But what corporations do is they get a family to say, I'm going to buy this house, and I'm going to also give you 5% of the total price to build of the sales price. And then what they do is they take that and they deposit it. So you kind of mentally move in and you have a little bit of money and skin in the game, so it's hard to get out. And then the other piece of what happens is the builder has less risk. They got 5% of your money that they can have on their balance sheet. That's a big deal. It changes the game. Now, they might lose a little bit of appreciation, but they have mitigated risk. And what people are starting to do in a lot of instances is they're starting to really just ignore fundamentals because of how good the market is. And most of you people haven't been in the market for an entire recession. We talked about this with Alistair. Most people who are in the real estate game now are half cycle. They got in at the last downturn. They didn't come in at the last peak and ride it through the last downturn. So they're not making good fundamental decisions. And I think it's crazy. Something else I hear all the time: is that debt recourse? All my debt's non-recourse. Okay, what recourse means is a bank can come after you. Non-recourse debt is I can't come after you as a bank. Default and see what they do. They're going to come after you. They are going to figure out how to get their freaking money back. And it could say it's non-recourse, but go default on 5 of those. There's a guy in Richmond who I've had lunch with multiple times who defaulted on a ton of loans. You know what happened to him? He went to jail They've said, you know what this guy did is he was a profiteer by not paying back these non-recourse loans, because that's what it looks like if you default. So if you take on debt, you better plan on repaying it somehow, because the people who give it to you, it's not for free, it's a loan. So but people are thinking that they're talking themselves into these incredible situations that don't really exist. It isn't right.
And someone like that, so take a guy with 400 homes in Arizona. It's what, $120 million of inventory without anything pre-sold, no deposits, no cash. That's all debt. Has that guy really stopped to say, what if there was a really ugly recession and sales prices dropped 15%? Where would that guy be if prices dropped 10, 15, 20%? In Arizona, where there's been a massive spike up, where would you be with 120 million if prices dropped?
What he said to me was this: Frank, we have an incredible way to market. We market different than everybody else. I'm like, that sounds to me like I don't completely understand your business, which is what WeWork said. It sounds like someone who else told me, we don't build houses, we're a tech company who builds houses. You're ignoring the fundamentals, and you're not being completely honest. You're putting blinders on yourself.
What did our chairman always say at the home builder we worked for? You don't make the market, you serve the market. I don't care how good you are at marketing, the market is the market. And if you got $120 million and a bank now believes it is worth 95 million, what are they going to do? They're going to call some of it. They're going to make some calls. That's the way it works. Okay, so anyway, the worst case is much worse than most real estate investors think it is. We'll get off of that. So 9, and the final question is, how does this decision balance with all of my other decisions? So typically, any decision you make is going to be at the expense of some other decision that you could make. There's only so much time. There's only so much money. There's only so much of you to go around. So I think what a lot of people don't think about enough is how one decision impacts so many other things in their life, or investments they could make, or other decisions. I personally go through this. I'm going through it right now. How much more consulting can I take on, knowing that we're launching a product in July? And I have an opportunity to do more of the consulting, and it pays really well, but it's also demanding of my time. I know you go through this with your mastermind all the time, of every time you're gone for a full week at a mastermind, what could you be doing with your business? How could you be spending that time different? So I think really trying to force yourself to say, what expenses come as a result of this decision? How is this impacting?
I remember when I quit my job, and I remember when I was struggling to build this business, and these people would show up and they would talk to me about your most precious resource is time. And they sounded like arrogant pricks, because my most precious resource then was cash. Like, I was completely and totally scared shitless that I was going to lose everything I had, and I was going to have to go put on a suit and go get a job. And I was scared to death. But they were right. Now, their message delivery was garbage. What they should have said is, what you want to get into is a position where you make enough of the right decisions. You spend enough time on system 1 thinking, where system 2 thinking can be about, how do I protect my time? If you were to focus your entire business strategy about taking complicated and making it uncomplicated, taking system 2 and making it system 1, what you then get the luxury of is to get to a point where you get to focus on your time. How do I put myself in the position that has the most upside, that has the most dynamic or exponential return? And that's what it comes down to. But most people can't articulate it. Most people don't do it. Most people don't work and grind to get to a point where you get to make these decisions. And you have to look at all of this as a flywheel. If you have bad decision makers around you. You have things that are pulling at you. You have negative stuff going along with positive. The negative starts to outweigh the positive, and it starts to pull you back and pull you down. And it allows you or forces you to have to focus on things that are more in system one, because it's just the way it works. And most people spend so much of their time misappropriating how they make decisions. It can influence you.
I think I'm going to wrap it up with that. I like that question that you ask yourself, but I think anyone could agree that time is a precious resource, and it's nice to have freedom. That's really what you're saying when time is important, to have freedom. But I think what Frank said is really important. If you don't make decisions that build your wealth and build your cash position, you'll never have that freedom. You'll always be working more and more and chasing and doing other things. And I think also, if you make the wrong decisions, even if you have time, it won't be your time, because that real estate will be up in your head. So I think about someone with $100 million of debt, and the stock market drops, and all of a sudden real estate prices drops. I don't care how much free time you think you have none. All you're doing is worrying about your debt. Will I go bankrupt? So I think having some level of safety, making decisions that give you upside, but are conservative enough that you don't lose sleep every night, that I've taken on too much. I think that's incredibly important. Your time won't be yours if you are all in on risk. So I think everything we've tried to talk about today with examples, you have to be relatively conservative, but you've got to take on enough appropriate risk where you move yourself out of a certain range where you'll always just be grinding day in, day out, day in, day out. And I think these 9 questions, regardless of what the big decision is, can really help knock some of your system one thinking out, take some of your biases out, and help you make better decisions.
The way I'm going to wrap this is, you need to have a system about how you make big decisions. These 9 questions I always consider. It's not like I have these etched in my arm with a tattoo, but I come back to the same type of process over and over when I am conflicted or have a big decision to make. And the more big decisions I make, the more confident I get making another big decision. Because if you make the right decision, great. But if you make the wrong decision, you're forced to make more decisions. And that gives you more of a time or a chance to kind of hone in on what is the right decision around this.
I think you've done an incredible job today. I mean, the best decision of my life is choosing you as a co-host. I'm really proud of you. Really proud of you.
And I agree with you.
Biased. I made a mistake there talking to you about it. Biased. See you, homie.
See you again.